Hello, everybody. Welcome to the St. Andrew's Psychedelic Society. My name is Ali-Reza. I'm the Events and Healing Officer here at the Society. Today we have a wonderful guest, somebody I've actually spoken to once before at the Oxford Psychedelic Society, and that's the amazing Dr. David Luke, who is an Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Greenwich and an Honorary Senior Lecturer at Imperial College London Centre for Psychedelic Research. He teaches and researches transpersonal experiences, psychedelics, and altered states of consciousness, and has over 100 academic papers and 11 books, including DMT Entity Encounter in 2021. He's also the co-founder of Breaking Convention and has led clinical trials with LSD, DMT, and has studied consciousness practices worldwide. His unique field of study is called psychedelic parapsychology, which is essentially the idea of studying psychic phenomena under the influence of psychedelics. So thank you so much, David, for joining us. We're really excited to answer the big question here, which is that can psychedelics make us psychic? Whether it's during the psychedelic experience itself or perhaps afterwards, which is another interesting question. But I'll leave this to you. Thank you, everybody who's come today to join us. We're really excited to share the space with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here, Ali-Reza. I had a really great time in Oxford with you. It's really nice to be here. I haven't made it to St. Andrews yet. I gave a talk in Dundee once, and there was a lot of students there from St. Andrews, and I think we stayed in the pub afterwards for a very long time. But yeah, I'd love to make it there sometime. I'm just going to share some slides with you, if that works. Yeah, let's see how this goes. Unfortunately, I'm going to leave it in kind of editor mode, so only because I kind of forgot I was giving this talk and I haven't prepared, and so there's no way of seeing what my slides are ahead of time in the normal view. So I'm going to just leave it. I might even edit them as I go, but let's see. So I've got a slightly different title of Exploring Psi with and Exceptional Experiences with Psychedelics, but it might be along the lines of what you said, like does psilocybin genuinely induce psi, PSI? So psi is a kind of an umbrella term we have been using in parapsychology since the 1940s, roughly about the same time we discovered the psychedelic properties of magic mushrooms. That was actually discovered by Albert Hofmann, who named psilocybin and psilocin, the two active chemical principles of psilocybe mushrooms, and yeah, he wasn't really aware of the term psi for paranormal phenomena at the time, as far as I'm aware, but he did speculate about the possible psi-inducing qualities of psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD. I might come to that. I'm going to give you a little bit of a potted history and tell you about this area of research. So, my work is what I call it under the bigger umbrella of exceptional human experience. So that includes all kinds of like transpersonal or paranormal like experiences, spiritual, mystical experiences. And it's a more neutral term there and broader as well than parapsychology or transpersonal psychology even, and includes all of those kinds of things. Stuff what you probably wouldn't ordinarily see on a toilet door. Like, I don't know, running around with your head on fire or kind of cross-dressing or whatever it is. I think that's probably more a Kundalini experience, actually, and perhaps a kind of possession experience. So all of that weird and wonderful kind of stuff. And this has been the kind of coalface at which I've been digging away at for far too long. I've been publishing papers on this for about 20 years and looking at all kinds of exceptional experiences, including the softer end of the spectrum, if you like. So kind of neurocognitive styles, things like synesthesia, aphantasia, blindness, HPPD, autism, and then getting into increasingly more weird territory like extra dimensional percepts, out of body experiences, near death experiences, entity encounters, sleep paralysis, interspecies communication, and ecodelic experiences, possession, theranthropy, whatever that might be. Maybe you can ask me afterwards. The umbrella term psi, which includes telepathy, direct communication between two organisms, precognition, getting information from the future, clairvoyance, getting information from a distant location, and psychokinesis, which is much rarer, and we don't tend to see that very often um, with psychedelics or generally even. But and it's probably harder to grok in many ways because it seems to defy more of the laws of physics. Most of my research is focused on precognition, so I'm going to talk about that. But I also cover, of course, mystical experience and ontological shock as well. So that's kind of what I've been doing on my holidays. Um, a lot of that work, if you are interested, and this is a bit of a plug, is you can be found compiled in my fairly recent book, Other Worlds, Psychedelics, An Exceptional Human Experience, which I have to say has probably got a better cover than it has contents, but that I just really like that artwork, and but it is not such a bad read. Anyway, so yeah, the study of psychedelics and how they interact with parapsychology. So parapsychology is the study of psi and other paranormal-like phenomena, be they real or not. And actually, in the early days of the kind of the psychedelic kind of academic interest, beginning in the 1950s, shortly after the discovery of LSD, a lot of those early pioneers of psychedelic research were also interested in parapsychology and vice versa. So a lot of parapsychologists became very interested in psychedelics, and for quite a while, there was a lot of cross communication between the two fields, of course, until prohibition and the war on drugs started in the end of the 1960s. And then both of these research areas, which were already, somewhat on the edge, felt like it was too taboo, to continue their kind of liaison. And parapsychologists shunned psychedelic research for being not being respectable. And, psychedelic research just went underground. Now, psychedelic research is very much a hot button topic. Researchers have been slow to peer into the parapsychological research field for all of the same reasons that parapsychology has managed to remain taboo all these decades and doesn't have the scientific appeal that psychedelic research does. But that seems a little bit unfair. And if we look back at all the kind of the origins of, the discovery of psychedelics in the West, at least, we see this kind of crossover. And many of the first discoveries had a kind of parapsychological element to them, such as in 1953, when R. Gordon Wasson and Valentina Wasson went to Mexico to encounter the Mazatec people on a tip-off from the English poet and playwright Robert Graves. They first encountered this Mazatec curandero by the name of Don Aurelio. He's the older guy with the turban, not the little kid. And Don Aurelio performed a mushroom ceremony for them. And it's the first time any Westerner had witnessed this particular ritual of the ingestion of psilocybin containing magic mushrooms. And during that ritual, Don Aurelio told the Wassons several things about their son, primarily back home in the States. Both of which, the two things they told him specifically, they reported were true, but neither of them knew it at the time. And they actually didn't find out until they went back home to the States and discovered the two things that Don Aurelio had said about their son were actually true. So thereby, Don Aurelio, the question remains, how is it that this man, 5 days donkey ride up a mountain in the middle of nowhere, could discern all these things about their son back home? Probably through precognition, because one of the things hadn't even happened at the time he reported it. He precognised it, or some kind of clairvoyance or telepathy. So the very first Western encounter with magic mushrooms has this paranormal event tied to it. Of course, the Wassons, here they are, did the sensible thing. They took some samples of the mushroom, psilocybin mexicana, I believe, and they sent it off to various pharmaceutical companies around the world to try and identify it. And they did what they usually do, is they tested it on lab animals. And of course, lab animals don't say very much when they're tripping or when they're not tripping for that matter. So they're not very good test subjects for discerning psychedelic agents. and they couldn't discern what the active principles of the mushroom were. Some eventually found the way into the lab of this man, Albert Hoffman, who you may be familiar with, who, like a decade earlier, in 1943, just last weekend, in fact, 82 years ago, discovered the psychedelic properties of LSD by having some kind of, what did he call it? A curious presentiment to go back into his lab and resynthesize this chemical he'd made 5 years earlier, and which he accidentally ingested and had the first world's LSD trip, which kind of somewhat freaked him out. Decided to cycle home. He thought he was going very fast. Turns out he was going very slowly. And when he got home, he had an out-of-body experience, found himself floating up on the ceiling, looking down at his body, thought he'd died. So he had a kind of like the first ever acid trip involved what seems like something like a near-death experience as well, and an out-of-body experience. So Albert, a decade later, is sent some of these mushrooms from the Wassons to try and identify the chemical constituents. And he did the very sensible thing of, instead of doing a simple chromatography separation of the different alkaloids, but instead of giving it to lab animals, he fed it to his human lab assistants and took some himself as well. And of course, he struck lucky and he got psilocybin. However, having been terrified on his first acid trip, he took the precaution of having a medical doctor with him on this occasion. But he probably rather wished he hadn't, because when the doctor came over to take his pulse with the stethoscope, Albert saw him as a Aztec priest, resplendent with feathered headdress, and instead of holding out a stethoscope, he's coming at him with an obsidian knife to cut out his beating heart. So it didn't really help having a medical doctor there on hand to reassure him. And Albert actually noticed that when he gave either the psilocybin or the mushrooms, it's not quite clear, but when he gave people psilocybin in Switzerland, in Basel, where his lab was, even though they did not know the provenance of this mushroom, i.e., that it came from Mexico, they often reported seeing Aztec temples, Aztec altars, Aztec artwork, Mayan as well. And he was quite puzzled by that. How is it they naively were picking up on all of this Aztec and Mayan iconography? And he figured that they were actually tapping in to the consciousness of the original users of these magic mushrooms when they took them through some kind of clairvoyance or psychometry or something like that. He suggested this at actually a conference in the 1960s on psychedelics and parapsychology, when we used to have such things. And Wasson was in the audience, and Gordon Wasson suggested, well, it's a bit of a chicken in the egg, which came first? Was maybe the Aztec and Mayan artwork and temples and altars were inspired by their use of magic mushrooms, which actually, according to Occam's razor, seems a less plausible idea as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, of course, psychedelics began seeping out of the of the laboratories and started being used by various individuals. I should also add that actually Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond, who, Humphrey Osmond, psychiatrist, he gave mescaline to Aldous Huxley for the very first time, and the pair of them together came up with this term psychedelic. It was actually Humphrey Osmond that coined the term, and Humphrey Osmond himself and Aldous Huxley both believed that psychedelics could give you access to genuine psychic experiences. It was in kind of Humphrey Osmond's manifesto in 1952, where he suggested that we needed to accept the fact of parapsychological phenomena, and that psychedelics would be a massive breakthrough in psychiatry. Nevertheless, they began sneaking out the labs into therapy rooms, and people like Stanislav Grof, of course, was one of the kind of great pioneers of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. He conducted over 4,000 psychedelic assisted psychotherapy sessions in a 20-year period. And he said he reported observing patients experiencing past life recall, out of body experiences, ESP, especially precognition, accurate remote viewing and space-time travel on a daily basis. So this was a kind of, a bit of an occupational hazard for psychedelic assisted psychotherapists. And he said, he was very much aware of the danger of sensory leakage and inference and all of these kinds of things. But he said he witnessed what could have only been some kind of psychic communication or transmission of information on numerous occasions, even in the absence of controlled experimentation. And then, of course, psychedelics began leaking out of the therapy we use and began being used recreationally. And we start to see some research looking at the survey of people using psychedelics and their experiences of paranormal like phenomena. Charles Tart did a survey in the 1970s that wasn't published till 20 years later, and he found that the experiences of telepathy, especially, but also precognition and psychokinesis amongst young Californian cannabis users was very high. And other surveys found similar accounts of people having the experience of telepathy. About 50% of psychedelic users reporting telepathy under the influence of psychedelics. I also did my own survey research. I started out in this area 20 years ago, and found that, yeah, a similar kind of thing, that half of all psychedelic users in our survey had reported the experience of telepathy, but also less so clairvoyance and precognition as well, and occasionally also psychokinesis. Now, and it's not just a matter of those people who are drawn to taking psychedelics are more likely to have psychic experiences, because those people who reported more use of psychedelics reported having more experiences as well. And we don't see these kinds of reports coming from the use of other psychoactive drugs like heroin or cocaine or alcohol or caffeine or whatever it may be. People don't tend to report having telepathic experiences under the influence of those drugs. So there you go. And so going back to the 1960s, there were some experiments conducted to try and test this idea that there is some kind of genuine kind of psychic information transfer under the influence of psychedelics. So some real pioneers in the field, like Walter Pankey, who you may know of more famously from conducting the Good Friday experiments at Harvard. He also ran some ESP experiments, and there was about a dozen experiments conducted back then. A lot of those experiments relied on the technology at the time for studying ESP or Psi, and that was these Xena cards, as they're so called. 20 pack of 25 cards with 5 different symbols, very simple and basic, the kinds of things that were supposedly easily transmitted, like less complex iconography. And the idea would be you would repeatedly kind of try and use your psychic skills in either a clairvoyance or precognition or telepathy design to try and identify the identity of the card. Now, this is called a forced choice paradigm, because you're forced to choose between 5 basic images. And a lot of those experiments without psychedelics that were conducted back in the day tended to rely on numbers, basically, because the effects were very, very small. Only slightly above chance. And so people would have to do repeated card guessing trials, often for several hours, to get the kind of power you needed, the statistical effects, to establish there was some deviation from chance. The technology got a little bit more advanced as the years went by, and started using automated designs to cut out some of the possibilities of sensory leakage and so on. And even having different rooms set up with the technology. This must be the 1970s, I'm guessing, by the groovy sideburns and the ashtray, of course, in the lab, but you don't see that much anymore. Nevertheless, so there were a number of these experiments conducted using this forced choice design, this card guessing design, mostly throughout the 1960s and a few afterwards. However, they tended to use naive participants. So nearly all of those experiments had participants who'd never taken a psychedelic in their life, gave them very high doses, and then proceeded to give them several hours of card guessing tasks, which you or I would probably imagine is not ideal. And participants very quickly said it was extremely boring, psychedelically immoral to make them do this on their first mystical experience. They're sat there tripping balls for their very first time, and you have to do 3 hours of simple card guessing tasks. I mean, it's kind of quite barbaric. And as a result, those experiments were not particularly effective. Later on, however, and concurrent to that, some researchers started using a different design, parallel to some of the incoming research which was happening in parapsychology, doing what's called free response, and that is the person in whatever conducive state would merely try and identify what some distant target would be. And it could be a painting that somebody's looking at in another room, or it could be an object, or it could be the contents of a room. And they would have to describe it in detail, but in a free response kind of way. We weren't looking at specific symbols. It was just like whatever comes to their mind in their mentation when they have the intention to psychically identify a distant or time displaced object. Um, and so it's a bit more conducive to when you're having a psychedelic experience. You just talk about the kind of the things that you're witnessing in your with your mental imagery, and as a rule, those experiments were much more successful. More than half of them had kind of positive results, if we can say that. However, they were still deeply flawed as a rule because almost none of them had control conditions. Um, to compare it to, and also many of them didn't use a kind of probabilistic rating scale, i.e., the idea with Ganzfeld experiments, the person who describes the imagery then would see four possible images that it could be, and so three of which are a decoy and one of which is a target, and therefore we have a probabilistic estimation of the accuracy of the person's mentation. So a lot of those experiments didn't really give us good statistical interpretations. However, they were kind of generally successful, but poorly controlled. And that's the kind of state of play of psychedelic parapsychology up until the 1990s. As far as I'm aware, nobody else has really done any experiments since then, apart from me, because I was stupid enough to commit double career suicide by studying both parapsychology and psychedelics. I've no idea how I still have a job, to be honest with you, but there you go. That's a different discussion. Um, and so for my PhD research, I'd started out by doing some forced choice research, not with psychedelics initially, just getting people to do a hidden precognition task, whereby they would just have to very quickly say which one of the four fractal images, fractal because they're completely neutral, and so forth, have no kind of emotional or kind of iconic baggage attached to them. They would get to do this task where they had to just say which one of the four pictures they preferred the most. It would happen very quickly. And then if they did well, they were given a reward of either erotic images or a punishment of one of these really boring cognitive psychology tasks. And that worked really well when people weren't on drugs. And then I decided to transpose that experiment to the use of psychedelics. And I went out to South America and spent time in Brazil and Ecuador running this experiment in ayahuasca ceremonies, which was an interesting challenge. However, this task did not transpose well to a psychedelic environment, for a few reasons, I think. One is that instead of just getting people to respond to their immediate preferences, I was getting people to try and visualize the target, which if you're trying to visualize some kind of fractal imagery, you, there's too much homogeneity of these images, i.e., they're all like Mandelbrot set fractal patterns. There's not much differentiation between them. So if you're tripping balls and seeing something akin to fractals, it's very hard to discern which one it might be. Also, there were other problems with the task, not least that I also had to drink ayahuasca during these experiments to take part in the ceremonies. That was the only condition that the people running the ceremonies would let me do my experiment. So, I mean, that didn't interfere with the experiment, but it did make it challenging for me. And ultimately found that actually I did a before and after, or before and during, kind of the ayahuasca experience test. And I also did the control condition where people didn't take ayahuasca. And what we found is that precognition scores actually declined when people were on ayahuasca. However, thankfully, I had a control condition. We also found in the control condition that people's precognition scores also declined, even when they weren't on ayahuasca. So what that tells you is that we have order effects, and that is there is some kind of test fatigue or test boredom effects going on here. So basically, this was not a good experiment. And we should also learn from the previous literature that forced choice designs are not particularly practical for psychedelic research. So I abandoned that after an interesting trip, uh, literally to South America, and spent the rest of my time in Ecuador, where I began investigating the research, the use of San Pedro cactus, which contains mescaline. And I was going to change my design. I was going to use a free response design, so like a different kind of setup, do away with the fractals altogether. But first, I had to find a curandero who would let me do my experiments in their ceremony with people on San Pedro. I found this one guy. He was brilliant, San Pedro curandero. He was like, "Yeah, sure, you can come and do your weird experiment in my ceremonies." I was like, "Great." People turn up, we get to do the ceremony, and then I pull out my laptop. I hadn't really explained what I was going to do, and he was like, "Whoa, like no, none of your electromagnetic juju in my ceremony. You'll scare off all the spirits." And so I couldn't do it. I was running out of time, and I had planned to get 20 people to do one trial of my experiment each whilst under the influence, as I had with the ayahuasca. And I figured, well, I'm running out of time. What if I just get one person to do the experiment, but they do all 20 trials? It gives the same kind of power. And so I had to look for somebody to do that, and I did, and that was me. So I decided to do a self-experimentation this time with mescaline. Now, luckily, the good thing about mescaline is it lasts about 12 hours. So, it's possible to do 20 trials of a parapsychology experiment. You're only nauseous for about the first 3 hours, and then you can get started. So, this was the experimental design. It's more a free response kind of design, very akin to the things we see in Gansfeld experiments or dream ESP experiments. So there's four stages: a visualization, a viewing, a voting, and a verification, basically anything that begins with V. So under the influence of mescaline, I would do a visualization and say, okay, I'm going to try and see if I can visualize what the target is. Now, all I know at this point is that the target is a 1 minute video clip scraped from some film. Okay. And then so I try and do my visual mentalization. I get some kind of imagery that I can actually name, and I write it down, and then I do the next step, which is the viewing. And therefore, I then view 4 1 minute video clips, which have been created by a colleague. They've been taken from a pool of films, and they're designed that each pool of 4 clips is as different from each other as possible. So they're very heterogeneous, which should hopefully make it easier to identify which one is most like your visualization. So then I'd see these 4 video clips, and then I would vote. I would say which one is most like my visualization. I'd rank them between 1 and 100. And so in this case, for instance, it would be, oh, yes, it's quite a lot like that scene from The Matrix, a little bit of the overview effect, not very much Rick and Morty, and a smattering of Mary Poppins. Standard psychedelic experience, really. We've all been there. And then we do the verification. I do the verification, and that is a random number generator would be ran to determine which one of these 4 was the target. So it's completely independent. There's no way I can know what the random number generator is going to produce. And the target hasn't even been selected when I do my viewing and voting process. So the information can only be coming from the future if am I to determine what it is, beyond chance expectation. And we know what chance expectation is. It's 1 in 4, 25%. Okay, so it's a fairly tight principle. And then we got to see what the actual target clip is. A random number generator says, well, it's either 1, 2, 3, or 4. It says which one it is. That's just me getting high on San Pedro, I think. And then there were 4 clips. If I have a chance to play this, I'll show you. So this was the very first one. I just did this as a kind of pilot test to see if I could actually function whilst under the influence of mescaline and do this experiment. And the detail I captured from my mental imagery, I kept quite simple and brief. So like it wasn't just voluminous kind of the entire trip. It'd just be something I could identify and name. So in this very first one, I said ancient Greek scene, eyes. Note to self, visuals are too vague and fluid. It was often very dynamic and hard to kind of label. And I also said, okay, city at night on a lake. And so that was all I wrote down. I then watched 4 video clips. And this one, well, first of all, I was absolutely tripping balls. So I don't know if this is going to work. Oh, what a tease. Oh, I've got the spinning circle of death. Maybe it will play. Maybe it won't. I don't know if you can hear that. Well, I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I have to say I watched it for a minute and I was kind of gripping the edge of the table because I was so kind of absorbed in what was going on in my mescalinated state. And then the clip finished and I was like, oh, what am I actually doing? And then I looked at what I'd written down. It said ancient Greek scene. And this, of course, is the fight of some Greek hero against the Minotaur. So I was like, okay, so this in principle is very feasible. I'm going to give you a couple of other highlights just to show what came out of it. This is one of the other ones I did, and this one was very simple. I wrote literally 5 words: desert, dunes, the sands of time. It was kind of like, oh yeah, a bit like that, you know, in the desert, the sands of time. And this was the clip out of the 4 that I chose as the target, which is also a bit slow to load. You can imagine, what might you imagine? Desert dunes, the sands of time. Which of 4 random clips might you possibly choose in this instance? I'm just kind of, this is just filler basically, whilst I wait for the spinning wheel to stop. This really is the sands of time, slow time, like Kairos. You know the difference between Kairos and Chronos? Anyway, I think it might be working now.
Their ribs, lifting them up in groups and pulling the scales of the underside forward and over the rib tips.
Not particularly impressive, but that's just the first part of the clip. Here you go. Desert, dunes, the sands of time, a sidewinder snake. So I obviously went, okay, yeah, that's the one that's most like my visual and mental imagery. I rated that one quite highly, ran the random number generator, and the random number generator, i.e. the computer, said, yes, that's the target. So in that case, that was a hit. I'm just going to give you one last example, and I'll try loading.
And it expressed.
This one starts straight away. This one was a bit more thematic, as often they were. So the previous one was quite direct, but sometimes they were just like, it has the essence of that clip more than the others. So this one was 12:32. That was just the time at which I started. Rotating like helicopter blades, space, more mechanical stuff, spacecraft, space skeletons. That was the first part. And the second part was water, a submarine, a big rig, but underwater. And of the 4 clips that came up, this is the one I chose as the target. And maybe you'll see why. Iconic 1-minute scene from Star Wars. Yeah. So there's Luke, and Leia blasting away. Space skeletons. Did it ever occur to you that, you know, when he was kind of designing the idea for stormtroopers, he said, yeah, we want to have like some 21st century kind of skeletons, like cyber skeletons, space skeletons. That's what stormtroopers actually look like. Then he pulls out this thing out of his utility belt, which is like a little grappling hook. But when I stopped it to have a look at it in more detail, it's actually like a helicopter blade. It's got these kind of 3 or 4 different blades on it, which he then spins round. There you go. Helicopter blades. And more mechanical stuff. Spacecraft. I mean, it doesn't get more mechanical than a Death Star, because it's just like this huge planet-sized mechanical object. And then he kissed his sister, which he didn't know at the time, and I couldn't possibly foresee. So there you go. That's so that, sometimes they were thematic, sometimes they were direct. If you don't believe me that stormtroopers are actually space skeletons, I did a kind of Google search on this eons ago when Google had only just come out, and it came up with all manner of kind of funky stormtrooper-esque space skeletons. So the outcome of it was that I got a significant result. I got 40% direct hit rate when I should have got 25% by chance. But also I looked at the sum of the ranks of like how the scores, the specific scores I gave to the individual clips, to give you a more nuanced kind of analysis, and that was, independently significant. And I later ran afterwards. I tried to do a control condition, obviously not in a non-blind way, when I wasn't on mescaline, and I kind of got at chance scoring. So, but this is only one person, one career suicidal psychedelic parapsychologist on his own tripping on mescaline, and it obviously needs replicating, but it showed that in principle I think this kind of experimentation could work. So I tried to kind of replicate this in other scenarios, and I was lucky enough to run a clinical trial with participants on LSD, and sneak into that protocol this precognition task, which they did it was a blind condition, so they didn't know if they're on LSD or not. They did a non-LSD and a not on LSD condition. There was 13 participants, and so there was a control condition, and they took either 50, 75 or 100 micrograms of LSD. Same scenario, visualizing, viewing, voting, verification, 2 trials each, one on LSD, one not on LSD, true random number generator. And this time I got a significant result again with people who weren't me. However, this time the significant result was even more curious in that it was only in the LSD condition. So they scored at chance when they weren't on LSD, but on LSD, they got a significant score. However, the score was in the opposite direction. So they rated the target consistently as the one that was least like their visual mentation. However, it shouldn't be significant in any case. Anyway, defies, kind of our understanding of probability. So this is what we call psi missing in parapsychological research, which sometimes find, particularly if people have a prejudice or a disbelief in parapsychological phenomena. So I looked at the personality variables I had of them. Now, it turns out these are all top-level scientists who were taking part in this LSD trial, and all but one of them had expressed that they didn't believe in parapsychological phenomena. So these were kind of big disbelievers. And what this result tells me is it looks like they're using their psychedelic precognition to show that precognition isn't real by identifying the target and rating it as the absolute lowest, because it should have been a chance otherwise, right? Which is quite interesting. There was also some kind of personality factors at work, possible order effects, because the placebo always came before the LSD. We can talk about that. But looking at their personality factors, we also got some interesting, significant results in that those people who are more neurotic, more introverted, and less open to experience scored lower. So the people who are less neurotic, more extroverted, and more open scored higher. And this is actually consistent with parapsychological research that openness to experience and extroversion, at the very least, tend to predict better scoring on parapsychological ESP experiments. However, there is a cure for this. The moral of this story is don't use scientists in parapsychology research as participants because they don't tend to believe in this stuff, and they'll use their psychic abilities to try and disprove its existence. However, there is a cure for being a scientist, and unfortunately, most scientists tend to be quite introverted, neurotic, and not very open to experience. So, not the best test subjects. There is a cure, however, and that is actually psilocybin, which tends to reduce neuroticism, increase extroversion, and make you more open to experience. But, maybe you need to take it quite a bit. So that was the LSD experiment. Curious findings, significant nonetheless, but in the wrong direction. And then the last experiment I did was with DMT. This time we didn't use scientists as participants. We used hardened psychonauts, participants who had numerous DMT trips. They'd all had numerous breakthrough doses, same experimental design. There was a kind of on DMT and not on DMT control condition. We counterbalance for order effect. So they either did it on DMT or before DMT, or on DMT and then later after DMT. So control condition, counterbalance for order effects. 20. Actually, this slide's old. There was 20 participants in total, and I'm going to give you one sneak preview of one of the experiences. So this is one of the participants said they saw a 3D hexagon, which they wrote in capital letters, which is mathematically impossible in real life. They're tripping quite hard on DMT, and that I could see from the outside and also from the inside. And inside, there were these cell organelles and DNA strands. And this is one of the 4 clips which they identified as the target. And it's a short animation of the splitting and rejoining of strands of DNA. So they rated that really highly. And overall, collectively, again, we found a significant result. There was a significant difference between being on DMT and not being on DMT, okay? And they scored more positively on DMT. However, there's another twist to that, in that when we break it down and look at kind of not just the order, but the scoring, we found that participants tended to score above chance on DMT, but below chance when they were not on DMT, okay? Now, if it was the DMT, which was giving rise to their precognition, then they should be just scoring at chance when they're not on DMT. However, what we found was when they're not on DMT, they're scoring worse than chance, much like my scientists in my LSD experiment. And so what this kind of suggests to me is that participants were demonstrating some kind of social facilitation effect, in that they appeared to be using their precognition to demonstrate that DMT induces precognition by getting the correct responses in the DMT task, but then counteracting that by doing really badly when they were not on DMT. So again, I'm not sure it's the actual psychedelics which are causing the precognition or giving rise to the precognitive effect in this experiment. So that's kind of it. I'll probably draw a line under it there, and maybe I can tell you about my current experiment if I get a chance. So thank you for your attention. That's about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. David Luke. That was an amazing
Oh,
presentation.
turn my volume down. I can't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, wonderful presentation. I just had an idea as you were sort of presenting that there's a lot of people in society who claim to be psychics, maybe like find some talented psychics as sort of your baseline, and then find people who are also psychonauts, but also psychics, to study sort of the same experiments you are explaining, but the difference between people who are psychonauts alone and people who are psychics and psychonauts. Because if they're talented psychics, or if they have had some training in Taoist meditation, mindfulness, some mental training, because again, I think a lot of psychic phenomena requires some training, as it was understood in the remote viewing experiments in the United States, that they had rigorous training for people to go through, for them to be able to gather information from the future. So there was a training involved. So what are your thoughts on having this idea of training people, or people who already have done the training in psychic development, whether it's precognition or telepathy or remote viewing, and then give those psychedelics and just to see what happens? Do they enhance their psychic powers? Do they not? Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that might well work in some respects, but yeah, you're right. I think they also need to be psychonauts as well, because some of those original experiments giving people who are naive to psychedelics big doses and then getting them to do tasks, spectacularly failed because people were just too busy tripping for their very first time. So they'd have to be seasoned psychonauts. And there is some argument to say that people who profess to have some ability or have engaged in some kind of mental development, mind control techniques will probably also do better. Interestingly, in our DMT one, we did look at people's prior precognitive experiences that they reported, and there was a relationship. So those people who said they'd had, more precognitive experiences tended to do better. So that, but even then, we get an effect even with unselected participants, just psychonauts. You probably increase the power by having selected individuals. It makes it more complicated to recruit, but nevertheless, we can just like monitor people's prior experiences, monitor their level of meditative practice or mind control practices, and you can see that there usually is a relationship with those variables. Certainly in my experiments, anyway. But under ideal conditions, yeah, you get pro psychonauts who profess to have psychic experiences anyway. But my current guess is that the problem is with all of this, it's slightly confounded anyway, in that we find these kind of effects in people not under the influence of psychedelics anyway. So is it that psychedelics make it more apparent? These experiments don't necessarily seem to show that as yet. It needs more research, but it does seem to facilitate it. It might facilitate a psychic experience in an experiment, possibly not in ways you might anticipate. So I think, psychedelics are like Huxley said, may be the occasion, not the cause, in that they give the person a license to have a psychic experience and not immediately shut it down or discredit it, as often is the case when people have spontaneous psychic experiences. They very quickly question their sanity, and it induces all kinds of cognitive dissonance when people have it. What's been termed the fear of psi. There's very good reasons why we may have inbuilt anxieties about having psychic experiences, because that way madness lies, and also the kind of implications of it as well. Like, if you can read minds and other people can read your minds, and you can't possibly have any secrets, and society would basically collapse overnight if we were all psychic, right? So and when we look at these experiences spontaneously, it tends to be really important, like, information that people have these experiences. Sometimes they're very mundane things that slip through, but generally speaking, most of the population won't tend to have many psychic experiences, and if they ever have one psychic experience in their life, it will be knowing that a dead relative or loved one has just died or is seriously ill. It's that kind of classic case of, you wake up in the middle of the night and then Granny's stood there at the end of the bed and you're like, Granny, what are you doing here? She's like, oh, and you go back to sleep, and then in the morning you find out Granny died in the night. That's usually the one kind of experience that most people will have in their life. So it's also about making it meaningful as well. These are very abstract. But anyway, I very much take your point on board. And I think, yeah, in ideal circumstances, that would work well.
Thank you so much. And another thought I had is, can psychedelics enhance psychic capability, not directly but indirectly through disturbing the predictive processing of the brain and changing the higher order beliefs? So you may have a high dose of psychedelics, right? And before you were a materialist, you thought everything was reducible to the physical world. Now you have a different perspective of the world. Maybe you experience oneness or mystical states. And then your brain obviously goes through a process of integration, your brain and your body and your mind. But in a lot of people that I've seen, they sort of become more open-minded to psychic phenomena because their prior beliefs were sort of disturbed. So I was thinking maybe a really beautiful way psychedelics do enhance psychic powers, capacity, is not directly, but rather indirectly through us becoming more open-minded, and the societal programmings that we have, the limitations that have been imposed on us, those sort of get faded away. And the more they get faded away, the more we are open to this psychic phenomena. And then maybe we can add some psychic training, some Buddhist meditation, some Taoist meditation to then sort of develop those psychic skills. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's several things happen at once, because you may have a psychic experience in the acute trip, and obviously many people do. You know, half of all psychedelic users have at least had that experience, though not necessarily in every trip. But you're right in that psychedelics very much change our worldview, our epistemology, ontology, metaphysics. People become more open-minded, the more open to experience. That's the psychological construct. And we do see that people belief in paranormal phenomena also increases. Interestingly, delusional ideation and magical thinking don't change generally after a psychic experience, but people do believe that parapsychological phenomena is more feasible and more real. So it's not like people are just becoming generically more delusional. It's kind of quite specific. And I think some of that is, yes, through these kind of restructuring our beliefs about the limits of reality and possibility. You have this big psychedelic experience and you don't even think it's possible to experience that. And that opens your mind about all manner of possible things. But what I will say is, in indigenous peoples around the world for thousands of years and the world over explicitly use psychedelics to transcend time and space and bring back useful information, the location of distant animals to hunt, the location of objects, how to, diagnosing illness, identifying medicinal properties of plants, getting information from the future, So this is for their worldview, it's kind of already a given and a standard, right? And it's kind of it's actually practiced as a living, breathing praxis, if you like. Whereas in the West, the so-called West, we have a rejection and reluctance to that kind of belief system. And I think psychedelics can very much lever open the cracks in those belief systems and make the possibility of these things seem much more permissible. Absolutely.
Another question I had, thank you for that, by the way, is a lot of the psychic phenomena is actually really hard to measure, like intuition, like wherever you go to the world, to the intuitive medicine people and medicine women of the native tribes, they just have an intuitive understanding of plants and which plants go with what. And some people may not categorize it as psychic, but I feel like a lot of intuition is already psychic if you already have a feeling of what plants go together, which is apparently how ayahuasca was found to begin with. I think that's a very direct evidence for me of psychic, but it's just not presenting itself in a form of a vision. It's more clairsentience, like you feel something goes with something else and you sort of do that intuitively, but it's always in the benefit of the society or the community. It's never to prove a scientific experiment. So I think another barrier is like if you can do the observations as these people are serving their community, maybe, I don't know, maybe that would be a better way, so that the point is not to prove. The point is just let them do what they do instead of just take a snapshot of a video of something to realize how they're putting these plants together. Maybe that, how do they know these things? Do they have a prior knowledge, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a scientist, it's always difficult, um, balancing experimental control with a kind of naturalistic kind of phenomena. And I try to do naturalistic field experiments as well as lab work, but it also requires kind of ethnographic sensitivity when you're going into indigenous cultures and so on and so forth. And it's kind of finding that balance, and some of the things I've observed in my time spent with indigenous shamans has kind of completely blown my mind, but would be kind of very difficult to shoehorn into a controlled experiment, such as, hanging out with a bunch of Huichol Marakamis, and, suddenly this ginormous dust devil, like about 200 foot up high, got up behind them because they were all arguing. Well, they were just all arguing. They hadn't noticed this enormous dust devil kind of appeared out of nowhere and started moving towards us, sucking up all the dried maize leaves in the field, and it was coming towards us, and it was going to hit us. And I was like, these guys paying no attention. I was like, hey guys, like, look, there's just this, like, and they turned around and they were just like, oh, whatever. And like one of them went, and the other one went, like this, and the whole thing just changed direction and just kind of went round us in a knot, and then carried on going in a straight line when it passed us. And me and my buddy were like, "Oh my God, did you just see that?" It's like, yeah, they just like shoved it like this. And meanwhile, they like in an instant, they were like, anyway, and they got back to arguing immediately. Like that was like totally irrelevant. Yeah, whatever. Just shove that out of the way. And then blah, 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 And it's like, wow, that's, astonishing to observe. But as a scientist, what do I do with that? How do we shoehorn that into a controlled experiment? And there are possible ways, but it requires kind of balancing control with kind of the naturalistic side of things as well.
The next question is from actually the president of the society, who's really excited to ask you the question.
Too much credit.
I'm honored.
Honor is mine. But just a quick question. So if you have two groups of people, one both sober, people who haven't ever tried a psychedelic and seasoned psychonauts, has there ever been, in your experience or otherwise through experiments, has there ever been an observed difference in psychic capabilities between the two groups, or is it much the same?
Between people who have use of psychedelics and those who don't. So psychedelic use and non-psychedelic, but not under the influence of psychedelics.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So I did a review of all the literature, like kind of from psychedelic research, from parapsychology, all the way back as far as the literature goes, and it's all in my book. Good plug. So thanks for asking. But and in those experiments where they've recorded whether or not the person was a drug user or a psychedelic user, yes, pretty much all of those studies, psychedelic drug users tend to score better in experimental parapsychology. Yeah. So that's a kind of like as a personality variable or something, if you like. So generally, there is that trend as well. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
So just to follow up on that quickly, what are the factors that actually govern if a person is more psychically capable, or is it just a general kind of?
Well, there are some. Okay, so I mean, there are some predictor variables. Openness to experience, extroversion, belief in the paranormal. It seems to be related to performance in experimental conditions. Usually mind control practices, meditation, qigong, tai chi, things like that, or yoga. Creativity. So creative people tend to do better as well in these experiments. And they're the kind of major predictors, really. And also, so the use of psychedelics too. So they tend to be the most robust predictors of performance in controlled psychic experiments.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
We open now to the audience questions. If any of you has any questions, whoever unmutes their mic first just goes first. So So to give you guys an opportunity to speak in person. But if you don't want to speak in person, you can just sort of drop in your question and I will just read it out. So whatever you prefer. John?
So I have a question. I believe there are cracks in our typical reality, and I understand the scientific experiments, but I'm wondering what um, what do we know about people using this on a practical basis in their lives? I mean, there's the jokes about the stock market and so forth, but what's really been documented about people who have psychic powers and people that don't?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, there are limitations, I think. What we do know is it's largely unconscious. Okay. I think everybody has this ability. I think some people are much better at it than others. There are aficionados, like there are with any skill, like music or cooking or whatever it might be. But generally, I think everyone has access to this, but it's largely unconscious and it's very subtle, and it tends to only uh, have any practical value or valence when it's kind of really needed, like knowing that somebody has died. Like if you have some kind of kin, and you can see how this might develop evolutionarily before the internet and telegrams and telephones and all those kind of things. How would you know if somebody close to you gone away, if they were going to come back, if they were dead? How do you grieve that person? And you saw a lot of this during like the First World War, for instance. People, whole towns were wiped out, and like the town would know before it was communicated to them, because numerous of the people would have had those dreams or insights or encounters and apparitions of their dead loved ones. The storybooks are abound with these kinds of encounters. So it doesn't really benefit most people on a daily basis, but it does often intervene at crucial kind of life changes. And often these things tend to occur around trauma and stress as well. For the more professional or developed, obviously you had I'm good friends with Joe McMoneagle. He was the chief Stargate remote viewer for the DEA and the CIA and so on. He's really good at this, and he put it to practical use. They found planes that had disappeared in the Congo jungle, and all kinds of things. So it does have practical applications. A similar story, and this is from indigenous people. You may have seen this news account came out last year, I think, or early this year. And this is really interesting in that a plane had gone down in the Amazon, and there were like 4 or 5 kids on board and a bunch of adults, and all the adults died, but the kids survived. There was like 4 or 5 kids aged between 2 and 12. And they sent out in the Colombia, and they sent out the military looking for them. They had 150 military personnel looking for them. And it's like a biblical tale. They were in the jungle for 49 days before they found them. Right. And how they found them is that on the 48th day, they were like, we're never going to find them. Right. They found the plane, but they couldn't find the wreckage. They couldn't find the kids. On the 48th day, they consulted an ayahuasquero, a shaman. And the next day, it's like, oh, this is where you need to go. And they found the kids the next day. Right. Now, this isn't news if you live in the Amazon. What is
Right.
the news item here is that it made it into the world press and the broadsheets. Like, to indigenous Amazonians, this is not news. This is like everyday reality. This is what you do when you want to know something. The news story is that it made it into the news, really. So it does have practical applications. Thank you, John. Yes, John.
Just a quick follow-up. What occurs to me as I listen to you is that perhaps it would be interesting to do a study about people that are just extraordinarily lucky, extraordinarily successful. Just go investigate those people and find out maybe they're using. Frankly, I think precognition. I think precognition is something we all have access to.
I'm glad you said that, because that was my PhD thesis. I looked at luck as a euphemism for psychic abilities, in this case, precognition. And we looked at those people who believed they were lucky, felt they were lucky, perceived themselves to be lucky, and also believed that luck was something that you could, in the right circumstances, manipulate. And then we gave them this hidden precognition task they didn't know they were doing, and gave them a reward for doing well. And those people who said they were lucky tended to do much better on this experiment. And interestingly, those people who said they were unlucky, not many people actually said, no, I'm really unlucky. They did really badly on this test, and it's like, and they got punished. And so I think there is something in this, and this is a completely unconscious task. People didn't consciously know they were doing a precognition task, but their luck related to their performance on this unconscious precognition task. So yes, I do think there's something in it, and that speaks to the fact that it's both subtle and mostly unconscious as an ability. So yeah, thanks. Thanks for picking up my PhD thesis, John.
Well, thank you for all that. I'll follow up and research you in depth. Bye-bye.
Anybody else has a question? Just jump right in.
So there's a one from here from Neural Not. What's the point of trying to demonstrate using the scientific paradigm, parapsychological phenomena? What's the point? That's a good question. I mean, just as scientists, we want to know and we want to understand the way the world works. Parapsychology, although it's kind of much maligned and very kind of like an edge science and hasn't been accepted into the mainstream in the 143 years it's been done, right? And yet it has huge implications. Like it speaks to the possibility of many different things, that maybe consciousness isn't confined to the brain, that it's not a materialist reductionist world that we live in, although there are materialist reductionist parapsychologists as well, actually, who are trying to find physical theories to explain psi. But it has big implications. That has implications for how we do research. Like, it's hard enough to kind of, we know how to double blind experiments, but if there's a possibility of psi seeping in, then like, how do you know what are we maybe just like getting the results we want in science because we are unconsciously predicting or selecting the participants in a precognitive way? So it has huge ramifications, and I think it undermines a very fundamental basis of science if we accept parapsychology, and that's part of the problem. If you think of, like, okay, the Higgs boson, this is a brilliant one. So the Higgs boson, you get all these physicists who have this theory that this particular particle exists, and they build this kind of really elaborate experimental protocol, the kind of the Large Hadron Collider, spanning miles and miles underground in Switzerland, and they do all these experiments. And the only way they can define whether or not the boson exists is probabilistically. So they get a kind of a 5 sigma result or whatever, a 6 sigma, which is like, one in, I don't know, 40 million against chance that they get this result. Fantastic. They spent billions of dollars and euros, and they find that, okay, this Higgs boson's probably real. Meanwhile, my colleagues from Princeton University did the what did they call it? The Global Consciousness Project. And they had random number generators all around the world. And then they looked at moments in time when people were kind of like consciously, collectively, all like had their attention focused on the same thing. And they would find these extraordinary deviations in these random number generators from chance, which collectively, when they pulled the data from 20 years, was like a 7 sigma significant, i.e. 1 in billions against chance, right? And like, on the face of it, these two experiments look pretty much the same. Could it be these physicists actually just, through their collective will and intention, affected the minuscule probabilities required to get the result they required? So it's an open question. So, like, the implications of parapsychology are huge for our understanding the nature of everything, really, but also they speak to a bigger interconnectedness, like the current secular, atheist, materialist, reductionist scientific endeavor, if you want to call it that, because it's not necessarily how we do science, wants to see us as inert, atomized, meaningless, like disconnected bits of energy or matter, and I don't think that's very good for our well-being as a species. We are actually all probably interconnected and alive. So I think it's a more positive way. so it speaks to a possibility of something which I think, oh, I'm talking to you, is um, yeah, it upends our fundamentals about the nature of reality. Sorry, it's nice to see you there. Go ahead. You're muted, by the way.
I think you're still muted.
Oh, have I been muted this entire time?
You've been muted the whole time. You just started talking now, though, so that's great.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah, I was commenting the entire time, but I
Oh
guess
no, I'm so sorry.
I was screaming into the void. Not uncommon. Yeah, just wanted to, I guess, briefly then mention, maybe you noticed the brief parapsychological or precognitive moment when I joined the Zoom meeting late, and I joined it just at the moment when you mentioned Chronos and Kairos,
Okay.
and I just picked a tarot card from a tarot deck that I'd encountered for the first time a few days ago, and I picked Kairos and formed this nice connection. So it was a funny joke to arrive late to the question, Kairos or Chronos? What's the difference?
Well, it has to be Kairos every time, right? Uh, but which is a beautiful synchronicity actually, and quite poetic because of course Chronos is ordinal, linear, directional time, right? But kind of transecting that is Kairos, the other deity of time, and that is magical time, time out of time, time that can go in different directions, and that's the kind of time we're properly tapping into with precognition, if it is indeed real. And what do we know? If we speak to theoretical physicists about the nature of time, they say that our subjective linear time does not exist. Currently the leading theory on the nature of time posits like the block universe as the most probable kind of explanation of time. That is, everything happened simultaneously from the Big Bang to the Big Crunch. It's all happening at one time. But for some reason, with our ego constructed minds, we perceive this linear kind of time, which is the basis of all of our reality and science and all the rest of it. And yet physics, it says
What do you
itself, says
mean we
that's an illusion.
perceive linear time?
Sorry?
What do you mean we perceive linear time? I'm
Well,
not sure about that.
well, I mean, generally speaking, like if you asked most people in a room, time goes forwards. Like, we don't perceive time going backwards, except for in moments of precognition, whereby it's seemingly we can get information from the future. Now, time can, like, we know it, but it's also elastic. We do know that, and we kind of accept our subjective time is elastic, and it slows down, like perhaps when you're in an accident, or it speeds up when you're having fun, or there's different kinds of time, but it usually considered to go in one direction.
Could
Uh,
I ask another
yeah,
question? It was a follow-up question to the first one about why should scientists, what's the point of scientists asking these questions or trying to define parapsychology? What if one could try a fun experiment with parapsychology and meme coins?
and meme coins. I'm not sure I know what meme coins are.
It's just crypto tokens, but then with funny names to them. What if
Okay, I see what you
one
mean.
could
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
test
yeah.
like that and actually also maybe if parapsychology is real, quote unquote, one could raise some funding for more research.
This is an interesting question. I think John had also alluded to this. There have been some research studies done. There was the silver markets remote viewing experiments, which started out very successful, made hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then lost all the money. Uh, there have been various characters throughout time who've professed to use their psychic abilities in casinos as well. Um, Not least Ron Hubbard, not L. Ron Hubbard, but Ron Hubbard, the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, who turned on most of the heads in the 1960s, said he had this trick. He trained himself from taking LSD and mescaline of being able to know what the like the roulette wheel was going to do kind of thing, and made loads of money in casinos, so much so that he got thrown out of the casinos. But to demonstrate it consistently hasn't been very reliable. And this is an interesting question. It's like it seems like it has a utility to a point, but it is completely undependable. You can't depend on it to reliably produce cash. And as soon as you start losing, like people very quickly stop wanting to fund the research if you're basically gambling with hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there have been some experiments, some of which were successful initially, but didn't maintain consistency. So you have to remember that in the experimental conditions, like what we're finding are very small effect sizes, like they're just significant, just above chance. So like, okay, in these kind of free response kind of experiments, we get somewhere between 35 to 25, 35 to 40% hit rate compared to 25% by chance. So it's only a bit like the kind of the difference between a placebo and an SSRI, right? It's kind of slightly better, but you don't really want to stake your life savings on it, okay? Because it is probably going to be wrong more often than it's right, but it's going to be right slightly better than chance, okay? So it's not reliable, I would say, but otherwise we'd all be minted.
Why is it only slightly above chance when it could be a lot higher than chance? If, for example, well, you mentioned and described all the ayahuasqueros and indigenous shamans, wouldn't they score much higher than chance consistently?
You would hope so. And that'd be interesting to test, and I'd love to do some experiments along those lines. But it, it's not the easiest kind of research to do. It involves a lot of deep ethnographic engagement, and I've been working with this indigenous community for 14 years, and I'm still a bit shy about doing a parapsychology or a weather control experiments with them because they'll be like, "Wow, what's the point?" kind of thing, or they'll just take the piss out of me or something. So, but like, yeah, you would expect some people to be consistently better, but I think the reasons why it's not completely accurate is probably for good reason, and I think a lot of those factors are probably psychological. Like I think it is probably a weak signal. I think like there is a lot going on in the human mind at any given time, especially mine is just mayhem, and trying to kind of filter out the signal from the noise can be problematic, and it could be subject to all kinds of things like your emotional state, fear of success, fear of failure, all of these kind of things, kind of psychological factors which can interfere with very subtle abilities, okay, like this. I think that's something that is inherent. One thing we did do is we studied Tibetan Buddhist lamas and yoga practitioners in India for who had like decades of experience, and we found after about 20 years of hardcore meditation, the lamas got very good on these experiments, right? But it takes about 20 years of dedicated meditation before you start consistently scoring high.
How could we speed that up? The cultivation of that ability.
I mean, maybe we just all need to maybe we all need to slow down and do 20 years of meditation retreats rather than speeding up, right? That's like
Time dilation practices.
that's a good way of doing it, yeah. But it's an open question. It's tantalizingly subtle and unreliable. Like precognition, in my own experience, having had many precognitive dreams, especially, it's a bit like driving in the car, but you're only looking in the rear view mirror, and that is you only know what's actually precognitive after it's happened. Because I have many dreams, and there isn't anything precognitive in them, and when it is precognitive, like if the dream matches a near future event, you go, oh right, that was related to that. You only know once the event arises, and so it's kind of it's interesting, but not particularly useful. Anyways, I should pass it. Thank you very much for your contribution. John has his hand up.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks. I'd like to expand a little bit about what you hinted at is that our reality as we know it, our society, our civilization is not compatible with having superpowers. Almost by definition, superpowers is just doesn't fit.
Yeah, I think 21st century existence mitigates against these kind of abilities and phenomena to a large extent. We're in a kind of explosion of information. We are kind of drowning in information and distraction and activity. You kind of need to be like a still pool, a pond to kind of like engage with this kind of material in any kind of successful way. And like our 21st century life is completely anathema to that. And we find instances of that, like for instance, when the huge tsunami hit in Southeast Asia, whenever it was 2005, 6, something like that. Um, it killed hundreds of thousands of people who were just at the beach, and like this kind of tsunami came in. It was devastating. They went to the Andaman Islands, which indigenous people, they're kind of coastal, they live at the coast, and they were all fine. They were like these are people who are like uncontacted tribe kind of thing. They live, and there's also stories. So they managed to avoid the tsunami. And there was endless stories of animals breaking their tethers, like literally kind of chained up or tied up, breaking their leashes to get away from the beachfront. So a lot of animals kind of were aware this tsunami was coming and took evasive action, even under, difficult circumstances. But the vast majority of humans who were residing on the beachside didn't. And I think I think this is something fundamental that we all can access, but we all too often don't. And you're right, 21st century existence mitigates against it primarily. But we can't all be living in a cave meditating all the time, can we? So you're muted, John.
I was thinking a little bit the opposite. It's not just that our 21st century existence suppresses our psychic abilities. It's that if we allowed our psychic abilities to expand on any kind of major scale,
I can hear
it
you
blows
now.
away. It blows away the other reality that we've come to be quite comfortable with.
Could you just repeat that? I only caught the end of that. Sorry.
Oh, if we expand our use of psychic abilities, both individually and as a community, that pretty much obviates the other reality that we've become quite accustomed to and rather good at. I just don't think they're compatible. It's not just that they both suppress the other one.
Yeah, right. That's an interesting. It's a two-way street. I like that. Yeah. And of course, you can see that because hippies and all the rest of it, alternative living people have consciously dropped out of conventional society and culture often. Um, and like, yeah. And I know people who are extremely sensitive as well, like naturally. They don't need psychedelics or whatever. And they find it very difficult to be in big urban environments with lots of people. They struggle getting on trains and tubes and things where like if they feel like they're picking up on everybody's stuff, right? And it's just overwhelming for them, right? They just it's just too much. We didn't evolve we didn't evolve physically, mentally, particularly to live in huge urban conurbations. Uh, for most of our 2 million years of existence, we've been hunter-gatherers until the last, few hundred years of industrialization and technologization. And, a few 3 4 years ago, we passed a tipping point where more than half of the world's population now live in cities. And we're badly designed to live in cities, right? It's unnatural. And so, yeah, of course, for many people, that is not even a possibility because they do find that they are too sensitive for that kind of environment.
A follow-up sort of thought I had on this is, what if we take people to sacred sites, so-called power spots, whether it's the pyramids or other ancient sites that supposedly they have some energetic field there that is conducive to psychic experiences. Many people have reported seeing blue beings in the ancient Egyptian temples, or having psychic experiences in general in those sites. So what are your thoughts of, like if our environment is not conducive, take people to conducive environments such as the sacred sites, give them psychedelics, and see what happens.
I mean, there's some ethical issues there, but I think in general your principle is great. And I think just the act of going on pilgrimage to sacred sites in and of itself is a transformative experience, and that can open you up to the possibility. For a few years we were doing pilgrimages with Waradika Marakamis, the shamans of the Huichol tribe, going around to sacred sites in Britain and doing something similar to that. And that there were kind of quite extraordinary experiences. I went to Newgrange in Ireland recently, which is 5,500-year-old megalithic burial chamber, extraordinary architecture, lets in the sun just once a year at the winter solstice, and like that happened to be like liberty caps growing everywhere around it in the field around it, which it's kind of like as if it was kind of built there for that reason almost. And I have to say, I think I may have accidentally ingested some before I went in there, and that was quite a time traveling moment, I have to say. So I think maybe in some cases the ancients did also have a sense of the power of these things in relationship to the space as well. So good point. I think Brandon, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, David. At the one of your earlier slides, it mentioned about aphantasia. So I was wondering if you knew of any connection between the things that you're talking about and that sort of experience of aphantasia, whether the two can be seen to be related, or whether increase or sustained psychedelic uptake can sort of change people's experiences of aphantasia, or that sort of experience.
Thank you for that, Brandon. So there hasn't been much direct research on this. I've written a bit of some papers on it myself and looked into it, but there hasn't been any kind of systematic studies done. As far as I can tell, most people who have aphantasia, and I'll define it. Aphantasia is that those people who have no visual mental imagery. It only got given a name 10 years ago now, I think. Before that, it wasn't. I mean, it existed, of course, but people didn't know what it was, and that's because most people who have aphantasia don't even necessarily realize that there's anything different between them and anybody else, and they tend to think that people are often speaking metaphorically when they're talking about a mind's eye and so on and so forth. But it occurs in about 1 or 2% of the population, so it's not insignificant. And of those people we know, most who have had a psychedelic experience do not report obtaining any visual mental imagery. They may see some open-eyed geometric patterns, as you might do, but they don't get the kind of closed-eyed visual mental imagery that somebody with an ordinary visual mental imagery would find enhanced with psychedelics, even with really potent psychedelics like DMT. So I had a guy in our DMT field study. He'd taken DMT over 1,000 times. He had aphantasia, and he never saw anything. And in fact, probably the reason why he'd taken psychedelic DMT 1,000 times is because he doesn't have any visual mental imagery, and so therefore it's probably maybe a little bit less intense in some senses. There are a few cases. There's one case where somebody supposedly regained their visual and mental imagery, who had aphantasia, but they probably didn't have it from birth. So most people have aphantasia. It's congenital. It's like synesthesia. You're kind of born like that, and you never have visual mental imagery. This guy actually used to have visual and mental imagery when he was a kid. Then he had some trauma, and he lost his visual mental imagery. So his was probably kind of trauma-induced, functional rather than congenital aphantasia. And I've heard of 1 or 2 other reports of people seeing some stuff, but not regaining their visual mental imagery. So It would be interesting to do more research on that. I'd love to do a survey on that. My guess is that there are also different types of people with aphantasia. For instance, about half of people with aphantasia do get visual dreams. So they only get visual mental imagery in dreams. And the other half don't even get it in dreams. And then there are more extreme versions as well. So some people with aphantasia also have what's just last year been called an endophasia. That is, they have no inner voice either. They have no kind of auditory imagery. Like, I don't know, like 99.9% of the rest of us, especially me, I've got this kind of little monkey mind going jibber jabber the whole time, giving me a running commentary of all my thoughts. That must be really nice. So people with an endophasia also have no inner audition and no mental imagery as well. And it's interesting to see how, first of all, that's affected with psychedelics, and also then what can we learn about psychedelics and consciousness and the effects on the brain from people with these conditions, because it might help us understand something more about the visual mental processes going on. For instance, the guy who had DMT 1,000 times and his other friend who also had aphantasia, when they had DMT, they got entities, right? So Robin Carhart Harris had always said to me, oh, well, it's just visual noise. You get all this kind of stimulation in your visual cortex, and you get all this kind of like imagery in your visual mental imagery. And then you start, because your mind is programmed to discern faces like pareidolia, we tend to see faces, and therefore all the visual noise becomes a being. But that doesn't actually hold up if you look at people with aphantasia, because they have no visual mental imagery and they still get entities on DMT. This one guy's like, well, he took DMT. So yeah, we were on this like train and we were going zooping around. I was there with the boys and they were like, yeah, it was like really good fun. And they were like, yeah, there were elves, right? We were just these elves. And it's like, but did you see anything? It's like, no, I didn't see anything, but I was definitely on this train with all these elves, right? And it's like, and you can do experimental tasks like to discern behaviorally that people have aphantasia. There's this kind of retinal disparity task, I think, whereby if you get people to think or look at a bright light, their pupils dilate, and then you get them to just imagine they're looking at a bright light, and their pupils will dilate a little bit. People with aphantasia, you get them to imagine looking at a bright light, their pupils do not change. So it's not just it's not like they can't access the visual mental imagery. They genuinely don't have any visual mental imagery that changes them behaviorally. And yet they still get entities. So that kind of, there's something more we can learn about consciousness and the psychedelic experience, and maybe even entities, from engaging with people with aphantasia. So thank you very much for that question, Brandon. But it's probably not going to bring back anyone's mental imagery or give them mental imagery anytime soon, alas.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much for being here. Dr. David Luke, thank you so much for giving us your precious time. Really appreciate you. And hopefully we get to see you to come in person.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Back with our committee and the students here. There is an Instagram link that I've put in the chat. If you guys follow us, you can support our work. But also on the 3rd of May at 5 p.m., we have a talk with Dr. Rick Strassman, and that will be a live talk as well. So just follow on Instagram and we'll be announcing the talk soon. And you can just message us if you want to get the link. But yeah, thank you everybody for being here. I really appreciate you. Appreciate your presence. Appreciate your wisdom. Dr. David Luke, thank you so much again. See you soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you all. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.